Welcome, everyone, to our first fall webinar in the Finger Lakes Forecast Series. I'm Gay Nicholson, the president of Sustainable Finger Lakes, and I'm really glad you could join us today as we explore this emerging issue of how we're going to accommodate our need for large surface areas to host our wind and solar generation as we finally start taking rapid steps to reduce carbon emissions and protect our climate. I'm joined here by our clean energy intern, Melina Bimpong, and Holly Hutchinson, our climate fund coordinator, and our friend Renee Carver, who has volunteered to help us today and says he'll volunteer to provide Zoom to help you too, if you would like. We've been offering this webinar series as a place where we can learn together about the forecast for how climate change will impact our lives and our regional economy here in the Finger Lakes. For our spring series, we took a look at our food system, flood risk, and the growing threat of harmful algae blooms, or HABs as they're known, in our lakes. If you miss those, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Our webinars are at noon on the last Wednesday of the month, but if you can't join us then, you can just register for our webinars and we'll send you a link to the recording. So today we're going to explore an issue that is, I think, an inevitable outcome of the transition to clean energy. You know, it seems like every day brings us one or more reports of devastating climate-related events, from storms, wildfire, drought, or heat waves. And each year this is costing us billions more in damages. So we know we have to very quickly ramp up our efforts to stop burning fossil fuels. And we're finally starting to. The US installed 12.5 gigawatts of solar last year, its highest rate thus far. And it's become cheaper to build new solar farms and to buy fossil gas to power an existing gas plant. So we are on our way. California, I read, is sourcing 25% of its electricity from solar already. So we know we need to develop these renewable sources of energy, even as we are pushing harder on gains in energy efficiency and reducing demand. But at the same time, there's this rising tension over who gets to decide where these solar and wind arrays are placed. Although the bill was just pulled yesterday, there was a proposal from Senator Manchin of West Virginia to adopt new federal regulations to speed the approval process for pipelines, interstate pipelines, and electric transmission lines. You know, it can take 10 years to get through the permitting process, and we probably do need to be moving a lot faster in coordinating the build out, both of the grid and of renewables. You know, but given the dismal history of environmental racism and siting fossil fuel facilities and the creation of sacrifice zones to host our energy production, it is understandable that community groups and justice advocates want a real voice this time in deciding where these solar and wind farms get placed. Adding to the debate is the trend to cover thousands of acres of farmland with solar arrays because it's the cheapest and most profitable option. The solar leases may be a boon to farmers struggling to pay their bills, but others worry about food security in a world of shaky supply chains. These, I think, are all valid concerns from all the parties that are involved, but the place to get started is always getting educated on the details. What are the market forces? What are our options? What are the barriers? What are some potential solutions for the road ahead? And that's the purpose of our webinar today. And we have 3 guest speakers who could help us get started on developing our understanding of the issues that are before us. With us today are David Kay, who's going to lay out the basics of on New York State policy on solar development and agriculture. David's the extension leader in Cornell's Department of Global Development and provides leadership in the areas of energy, land use, community development, and regional economics. He has increasingly focused on the community and economic development implications of energy transitions, such as renewable energy, renewable electricity generation, and climate change, things like flood risk. Drawing on his training as a mediator, David's research and outreach efforts are particularly concerned with building informed decision-making capacity in the context of community controversy. And then after David, next we're going to be hearing from Kaitlin Whitney on the alternatives using farmland for renewables. She's an assistant professor in science and technology and society in the environmental science program at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Some of her ongoing research focuses on the potential uses and trade-offs of transportation infrastructure for environmental sustainability goals, including renewable energy production and pollinating insect conservation. And then Graham Savio will sketch out some of the potential for agrivoltaics in our region. That's where we combine crop or livestock production with hosting of solar arrays. Graham is the agriculture and horticulture issue leader at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Tompkins County, where he oversees programs that support farm viability and farmland protection, as well as the integration of ecosystem outcomes into farm management decisions. We're really grateful to our panelists for joining us today to share their knowledge. And we're going to go through all three presentations first, and then we'll hopefully have about 20 minutes or so to answer your questions. So please be sure to type in your question into the Q&A available at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll work to handle as many of them as we can afterwards. So let's go ahead and get started, David.
Unmute first. Okay, I'm going to go back and tell me if you can see my screen.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and then let me go into slideshow mode, into presentation mode. How about now? You see the whole screen? Perfect. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to, as Gay said, firstly, I'm glad to have you all with us today. I'm going to give you a pretty fast, kind of skipping over several high-level concepts during this presentation, and hopefully we can go deeper into in a Q&A session about things that you might want some more background on. I'm going to be focusing on solar electricity generation primarily, and my own work is mostly about utility scale or very large solar development. So within this focus, I'll focus on the largest developments that are being proposed for New York State, of which I might say there's very little on the ground experience with the large facilities. We've become familiar with medium and small scale facilities, but not with large because they're pretty new to the state. Just a very brief reminder or introduction to the fact that New York is one of the states, as it says here, under the Cuomo administration, that is trying to be a national leader in energy transitions and decarbonization of the economy. So we have some relatively aggressive policies in New York. In particular, there were two laws that were passed, which were quite relevant to this topic. One is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. These are all within the past couple of years. It really governs the overall decarbonization of the economy, sets some specific targets and overall policy framework. And then specifically for electricity generation and renewables, there was a follow-up legislation passed called the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, and it more or less reformed and restructured the rules for siting renewable electricity generating facilities in the state. There had been somewhat similar rules in place in the past, but they have been significantly changed. And I'm not going to go into detail on that now, but we could talk about it more later if you want. But I do want to point out that there was a lot of policy in place already. Here's just a partial list of the other kinds of policies that were already in place before this very comprehensive act was passed a couple of years ago. So New York has a lot going on. It's actually quite hard to sort of fully absorb the policy environment that we're working in about all the relevant topics. We're more in a policy implementation phase right now of the CLCPA, that overarching legislation. And there was a public comment period earlier this year. that is now closed, where there were opportunity, and they received many comments on this, on the plan. And that was on the draft implementation plan, really. And there will be a final version of what they call the scoping plan coming out early next year if they stay on schedule. So that, again, that's just kind of background for what I'm going to talk about. So as I said, I'm going to really, I think our entire webinar today is really going to focus on solar. There's a lot going on in other technologies, and in particular, just in terms of electricity generation, but in particular, offshore wind is going to be, if all sticks to the current plans, offshore wind will be another major source of electricity for New York State as it implements these plans. So I always like to start with just a little bit of a sense to try and give people a sense of the scale issues, because scale is like really important in thinking about these things in different ways. So most people by now are going to be familiar with residential rooftop solar systems. Are quite common, as I'll show you in a few minutes. And roughly speaking, most of these are in the 5 to 10 kilowatt range in terms of their capacity of generating electricity. So 5 to 10 kilowatts. Which is somewhat familiar to most of us in residential context in terms of what we use and what we see on our electricity bills. So in terms of metrics, 1,000 kilowatts is called a megawatt, and 1,000 megawatts is called a gigawatt. We already heard that term. I think I used the term gigawatt once. So if you can kind of keep these measures in mind through what I talk about next, it'll be helpful to you. Just another kind of little bit of a sense of scaling issues. 1 megawatt facility will, generally speaking, it depends a lot on specific context, but generally speaking, that can provide electricity to roughly 100 to 200 homes in our climate. And there's a lot of conditions on that about what that actually means, of course. But the metric that I pay most attention to is how does a megawatt translate into acreage required? Because as Gay said, there's a lot of land involved. One of the things about fossil fuels is they're very energy intensive in small volumes. Well, to get solar, you need to cover a lot of land area. So it used to be, we talked about 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. Now we're talking more about 3 to 7 acres per megawatt of capacity. And here's a citation to a recent study that has helped catch up. And why is that smaller acreage? Because efficiencies are continuing to increase in how the sun is captured and converted. Move along here. There are many different ways to categorize solar, but I'm going to introduce a couple terms. One is about distributed solar, which in sort of the English version of what it means is generally that the place the electricity is generated is close to where it gets used or consumed. In New York, it's kind of used more specifically to talk about anything smaller than 5 megawatt facilities. That's what the State Energy Authority calls distributed energy. I'll show you a little bit about that, but again, I'm going to focus on utility scale, which is greater than 5 megawatts. And then within the utility scale category, there, under the current state law, there's facilities that are permitted locally by the town, city, or village, and those go up to about 25 megawatts. And then state permitted facilities, which are anything these days, which are 25 megawatts or above, and some 20 megawatts or above under certain conditions. And they're reviewed by the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which was created by the new legislation. One of the factors, again, which Gay already alluded to, that I wanted to highlight is why scale matters. A lot of it has to do with the cost of development. So here is information that comes out of the National Renewable Energy Lab, showing what's happened to the cost of different scales of solar. It's looking at residential, commercial, and two kinds of utility scale, solar electric generating facilities, and it breaks it down by the different components of it. But the bottom line for this, the takeaway from this, is you can see really dramatic declines in the cost of generation at all scales. But you also see that if you look at the ones on the bottom, which are utility scale, that the cost of large scale facilities, this is looking at 100 megawatt facilities, that's pretty big. So translate that into acreage, that's at a minimum of probably 500 acres. That's a lot lower, than, less than half of residential in general. So, and significantly lower than commercial scale. So this is one of the sort of basic economic factors that defines what's going on here. Here's just a little bit of some mapping that we did about the state has been keeping pretty good track of both of what's going on in all scales of development. So each one of these dots on this map represents residential projects. Again, these are mostly very, very small scale. You'll think mostly rooftop, residential rooftop. Each of these dots represents quite a few facilities. If you try and map them all, it doesn't even, it doesn't work visually at this kind of size. So, but one of the important things to keep in mind is that this has been going on. Residential has been being developed for a long time in New York already, and cumulatively we have about 1 gigawatts of capacity in place in residential. So keep that figure in mind, 1 gigawatt residential. And here's just a chart that shows that it talks with, there's over 100, well over 100,000 projects already in place. And the key takeaway for this, from this chart, I would say, is that most of this capacity is already in place. There's a little bit which is known to still be in the pipeline proportionately, but most of the residential that is here that's expected, or at least that we know about, that's that we're anticipating is already in place, and there's proportionally very small amounts still to come. Contrast that with the non-residential projects, but are still in what they call I'm sorry, there's a mistake in here. It should be less than 5. Okay, sorry, no, this is not. Let me back up a second. So these are still less than 5 megawatts as individual sites. All of these dots on here, they show the scale. They're actually a very small number that are included in here that are a little bit larger than 5 megawatts. For some reason, I've never figured out. But these are all, the New York Sun programs work with these. They're in categories of commercial, industrial, and small commercial. You can see the distribution here is, again, pretty ubiquitous, but as with the residential, it's concentrated in areas where there's population already there. These are these maps in general follow where do people live and work. And if you look at the distribution between what's in place and what's in the pipeline, you're going to see there's a lot more to come that isn't already in place. So there's a lot of action in this size range and in these categories. Cumulatively, this all adds up to about 5 gigawatts of capacity. So remember, before in residential, I said 1 gigawatt of capacity. So this is 5 times as much in this category. Then I'm going to move on next to what most of my work focuses on, which is large projects, larger than 5 megawatts. And here's a map that we did about a year ago because things are changing in this all the time. So it's very hard to stay exactly up to date. But what it shows is the overlay, the actual boundaries of some proposed 40 proposed large facilities that we're currently undergoing state review, or most of them in very early stages of state review at that time. It shows the distribution of them and the actual boundaries, and it overlays it on a map, which will be very relevant when Graham starts his talk, which shows the green areas there are agricultural districts in the state. So what you can see here is these larger facilities are being sited mostly in western and northern New York, mostly. This has changed a little bit since that time. I could add more onto this if I updated this map. Here again is from that time period, a little bit more detail on the scale, size and scale issues, and lots of projects in the 20 megawatt range, which again is undergoing local review. But most of the capacity that was being proposed is in the very largest range, in the 150 to 500 megawatt range. Again, the smaller projects, even if they're utility scale, the smaller ones go into the State Environmental Quality Review Act review by local governments. The larger ones go through the Office of Renewable Energy siting for permitting. If I update this chart to this year, I haven't shown you the graphic, but in total, there's about 16.3 gigawatts of proposed capacity. So again, compare that to the amount that was 1 gigawatt, 5 gigawatt that I showed you in the smaller scale projects. And most of what's being proposed is in projects that are 50 megawatts and larger. So there's, bottom line here is there are a lot of what the state is looking to happen and what the private sector is looking to happen is to go to meet our needs by larger projects. That's where the market is taking us. So the official policy, we don't know how much solar is going to be in the mix. One of the big reasons of that is the official policy. There are some specific targets in the law that are kind of lower end targets, but fundamentally the idea is over the next 10 to 30 years, the market is going to determine whether it makes sense to electrify the economy by solar or through other technologies like offshore wind or possibly some other things that are still part of the mix, but not as prominent at this point. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to shift to how much do we think we're going to need? And here there's been, I'm almost done, by the way. There's a lot of analysis that's been done, but here's one reference case. So 20 gigawatts by 2050. So if this is how much we need, this is kind of a base case analysis. If this is how much we need, I think we can be quite optimistic about that it's quite feasible to get there sort of within the trajectory that we're already on. But let's look at scenario 4, 65 gigawatts. And I've looked at analyses to predict anywhere from this higher number 65 down to 3 gigawatts of additional capacity. So there are just a lot of contingencies that will affect where we actually end up going over what time frame. And I'm just going to introduce now in conclusion what I think some of the other presenters are going to talk about is that a lot of the land that is being affected is being cited for a variety of reasons. A lot of the facilities that are being cited on good soils and existing farmland. Here's one analysis we did of those larger facilities that shows almost basically 3/4 of the land affected was some kind of farmland. This is not necessarily where the siting, where the actual panels would go, but the land that the developers had site control over, because during the siting process, they have to move it around, but there will be a lot of farmland affected, clearly. And lastly, I think I just want to say that I'm part of an agricultural technical working group that NYSERDA, the State Energy Authority, has convened that has already put into place some scoring points efforts in terms of who gets what support from the state that tries to influence where development happens, but it's not a regulatory framework. It's an incentive kind of framework about who gets money. So we can talk more about that if people want to later. And then this is really just the introduction to the kinds of questions that I think Graham will address in more detail. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. There's a lot of good information, basic information for us to start to wrap our heads around this. And now we're going to switch over to Kaitlin Whitney from our IT, who's going to talk about, well, where else could these go?
Okay, can you all see my screen? Just doing our usual Zoom check. Perfect. So
Yes.
thank you. I'm joining all of you today from the Rochester, New York area, and I want to acknowledge that's from unceded Seneca lands. And so quickly, I just want to talk about an area that I tend to focus on, which is thinking about basically the side of the highway and areas that we would consider more marginal spaces that may not be competing with this kind of prime farmland that Gay and David have been talking about. And so just to make sure we're all thinking about the same kind of space, I wanted to show you this first, which is that the right of way, which is also in utility spaces, in railroad spaces, is all the land that's being held for the transportation infrastructure. And so when I'm talking about highways and roadsides, we're thinking about that area off to the side past the paved shoulder that's often in some kind of vegetation. And just to show you some examples of this from our region, here, for example, is one roadside that's along Interstate 390, right in the SUNY Geneseo area. There's some of my students. We were collecting some milkweed and looking at plants and insects back in 2018. And as you can see, because these sites are vegetated, there's been actually a big shift in conversation about, number one, how to manage these as habitats, but they do require active management. And this can mean that we can make different choices basically about how to manage them. They're often managed, especially in New York State, by mowing and sometimes by herbicide application or tree trimming, arbor services. They also run through every kind of habitat. So here, for example, from just some field work I was doing just last week, this is Lake Ontario State Parkway up on the lake. And you can see that this is a more grassy, fewer wildflowers here, but in part because of how highways are designed, these areas are actually required to have open space. So they tend to get a lot of sunlight. Trees are intentionally cut back. And people are thinking about whether or not these are areas that can be used to harness solar as well as other forms of renewable energy. Here's one more picture. There's lots of beautiful spaces that these roads and highways run through, right? They run through every single space all across our state. This is basically where a 390 turns into Interstate 86 on the way to Corning, which, we get lots of beautiful wildlife like bears crossing the highway. So there's really been conversations over the last 2 decades, including at all levels of government, about potentially using roadsides for renewables. And it's for 3 big reasons in particular. The first of which is this can be a way to actually reduce costs for both federal and state governments. So traditional sources for basically transportation maintenance and infrastructure maintenance in general has come from fuel taxes. So if we switch to more renewable fuel sources and electric vehicles, that source of funding may actually decrease. Another is to potentially raise revenue, especially, for example, if people are using roadsides for biomass harvesting. And the third is sustainability. So especially in states that have climate goals like David was talking about, or renewable energy mandates, these can be a way for states to actually achieve their desired goals in the future. So for example, the state of Texas, starting a decade ago, was saying, okay, roadsides, our highways are actually part of our state assets. How can we actually make the most money? How can we extract the most value out of these as possible? And putting renewable energy into roadsides is actually one of the ways of thinking about that. Florida has also done the same thing, commissioning research to understand if and how they can get the most value out of roadsides in particular. And another big piece of this is actually that there's a lot of land to potentially be tapped into here. And as David talked about, land is a big consideration, right? We just need acreage. So there's over 1 million miles of road in the US, and there's no one number that we know of for sure, but there's an estimated 10 million acres of roadside habitat that corresponds with that. Over 500,000 miles of those are managed by states. And it's estimated that, again, over 500,000 acres of land are actually managed by county agencies. This isn't just just an issue for state and federal governments. This is also a local issue that can be thinking about how to use roadside spaces and transportation infrastructure, potentially for renewable energy generation. Here in New York, we also do not have a known number about how much acreage is actually in roadside land, but seeing how many miles of land are actually managed by states in the highway system or in other federal aid highways and county highways, conservatively, we could estimate this would be thousands of acres of land that's in roadsides in particular. So I wanted to point out that even though we don't have at this point ground-based solar arrays in New York State along highways, we're a blank spot on this map right now. Some of the research I was doing last year looking at what states across the nation are doing, we do find this. So for example, if you've driven along the Massachusetts Turnpike, there are ground-based solar arrays running along the Turnpike. So this map here is showing you who has ground-based solar arrays or panels that are mounted on noise barriers, and additional states have put more solar arrays on other kinds of transportation infrastructure that's not next to the highway per se. So the state that's been doing this the longest is actually Oregon. Oregon was inspired by seeing this taking place along the Autobahn in Germany. And so back in 2008, they were the first state in the US to install roadside solar along a highway. They ran into a lot of challenges, both in terms of financing. So for example, in Oregon, the tax incentives were set up for private developers, but the state is a public entity that couldn't take advantage of tax subsidies. They created a public-private partnership to overcome this. They also ran into some other technical barriers. So one of the things that Oregon did as a result was actually essentially write up a guidebook so that other states can learn from the processes it took to make this successful in hopes of encouraging other states to follow. So Massachusetts also has ground-based arrays, but I just wanted to show you, this is a conceptual drawing of what it might look like to install these on noise barriers. And so if you've ever driven on some really large roads, including the I-95 corridor, you've probably seen these kinds of noise barriers, and people are exploring whether or not it would be feasible and basically cost-effective to put more solar panels on these, to use these spaces in creative and new ways. There are lots of great reasons to do this. Again, one of which would be this might actually power either vehicles for state agencies or buildings. Many states are thinking about putting these on rest areas or other transportation depots. Depending on the laws in the state and locality, they may be able to actually raise revenue by selling the energy back to the grid. There are state and local, a lot of variability about whether or not that's allowed. And the other is to actually think about whether or not this would be, again, helping towards a renewable energy mandate in terms of state portfolios. I will point out, though, that this may also be a challenge. So, for example, many states are now participating in the monarch conservation agreement that's voluntary to help support the monarch butterfly. Another one is expected for bumblebees. And so there may be some trade-offs in terms of using roadside spaces for one potential sustainability use that may conflict with another. And people are trying to figure out, can we basically have it all in these spaces? One challenge of doing this is the cost. The upfront costs of putting in roadside solar are very high, and many agencies don't necessarily have that funding, especially given the costs you're talking about. Public-private partnerships may be the way they need to go to get access to these spaces, which are publicly held, but take advantage especially of the financing. The incentives, again, are often tax-based, which public entities which have the land may not be able to use. And again, legal constraints. So I will point out that especially for renewables and solar, the Federal Highway Administration, in part because they want to encourage states to do more of this, has actually essentially put out a quick cheat sheet to say, here's how you can stay in compliance with all your federal mandates for safety in roadway design while still putting in roadside renewables. And just to show you one quick example of how they imagine thinking about what kinds of relationships it might take, but notice it's also complicated to think about how might that solar project go in, what kinds of developers and entities are needed to do this. It's not just, for example, the state. I also wanted to show you that some states are using bioenergy in their roadside rights of way by doing biomass harvesting. So I showed you a picture previously that lots of these roadsides, and you may have seen them yourself while going down a highway, are basically lined in grass. So if you're going to mow the grass anyway, maybe you could mow something else and actually harvest that and turn it into bioenergy, a renewable energy source. So there are some states that are doing this. This map includes states that are doing different forms of agriculture, including some biomass. but I'll point out that it may not be a great fit for every state. So for example, Colorado commissioned a report looking at how they could harness different forms of renewable energy in lots of their roadsides and found that they did have the ability to produce some biomass for bioenergy, but it actually would make only a tiny fraction of their electricity needed per year. So this may not be the route for every state or every locality that actually has roadside space to pursue. In general, there's some great potential opportunities here. Again, it may raise revenue if you can turn your haying operation into a revenue source. It may actually save money if entities can actually run their vehicles on the biofuel that's produced. And again, it may contribute to these goals that states or communities have for being more sustainable, especially for climate goals. And there still are also challenges. So for example, many agencies that manage roadsides are trying to reduce the amount of time that anyone has to spend into them because it can be very dangerous. So even trying to reduce mowing time is often a goal. And if we're spending more time out there to try to harness and harvest some of this material, that could be a concern. The others, this may require new equipment that agencies don't currently have. And I've seen that conversation happening between state agencies where they're asking, how could we even finance getting some of this equipment to do more innovative uses in our spaces? And again, costs. So even the seeding to potentially put in that bioenergy mix might actually be a cost that hasn't been budgeted or anticipated for yet. All of that said, there's even more kinds of renewables going in. This is a screenshot of an embedded map that the Federal Highway Administration keeps. The link is there if you want to go see it, and it's updated. You can click on all of these. There are also roadside wind projects happening. I will point out that most of the spots on this map are not along a highway. Most of them are on a rest area, for example, or on a parking lot. So it's really thinking about all the different ways we can harness transportation infrastructure. And part of what I'll just mention is that one of the challenges is that oftentimes, because now we're thinking about roadsides as this innovative space, these uses may be in conflict with each other. So for example, if we're going to put in a ground-based solar array, you might not be able to also put in bioenergy there. So states are having to think about which of these would I put in, what would I do? And there's lots of other services that people want to get out of roadsides right now. So for example, carbon sequestration for climate goals or wildfire mitigation, especially out west. So some states, this is just showing you a screenshot from Michigan, have actually tried to start thinking about how would we decide where to put in these different environmental uses of roadsides in particular. Basically, this list on the right is a giant list of layers they have in a GIS application where they map all of these and then help themselves decide. So they decided the bolded list of 7 at the top is what they think is most important to decide. Where might we put roadside solar versus putting in, for example, pollinator habitat conservation? And states and federal agencies doing transportation planning use what's known as context-sensitive design to think about managing stakeholders' interests and needs. And we might be able to adapt that to thinking about where to put, for example, solar or other forms of renewable energy more broadly, so that it's not going into land where there might be more conflicts. This is just one example that I want to point out of using marginal land. So the last one I'll leave you with is to point out that people also use other kinds of marginal spaces. So this map doesn't include New York, but is showing a map that the Environmental Law and Policy Institute put together, showing all of the spaces in the Midwest that are currently brownfields that could be turned into larger bright fields, meaning actually a solar array. So sometimes this means actually capping a space that has been contaminated and turning it into an energy production facility. We have an example of this right here in the city of Rochester. This is city land where a landfill was capped and it was turned into a bright field. And so this is one potential way of thinking again about what are other kinds of spaces that may not be in competition for land use. There is a program here in New York called Build Ready New York, where NYSERDA is trying to think about not just landfills, but all different other kinds of underutilized spaces that would, again, not be using some of that land that you might be thinking about as prime land or farmland to do this. So I'll end there for now and turn it over to Graham, but I just want to mention that if you see someone with a butterfly net on the side of a New York highway, it's probably me, so wave, and I'll turn it over to Graham now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlin. That was extremely interesting. I feel like I have a much better idea of what the potential is and you know, all those cost barriers, regulatory barriers we're going to have to deal with. So we're now going to hear from Graham, who will talk to us about agrivoltaics.
All right. Thanks, Gay. Thanks, Kaitlin and David, for setting the stage here. I'm going to start off here. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet.
Nope. Nope. Right. Okay. How
There you
about now?
Well, it's saying it's about to do it. But it hasn't shown it yet.
Never seen this before. It says paused. All right, we'll try it one more time.
And we all have your presentation. Do you want one of the rest of us to do it?
Okay. How about
There we
now?
go.
Is that
We got it
better?
now.
There we go. Yay.
Awesome.
Okay. Try for full screen. Okay, great. All right, thank you. So yeah, thanks y'all for setting the stage for this, for a bit of a conversation about the sorts of agriculture that may be compatible with the solar installations that are going up across the state, and some of the considerations that we should be thinking about with regards to where solar goes and what sorts of agriculture is being dual sited. So we're going to talk about what agrivoltaics are, and then a couple of those considerations. And I'm going to spend the bulk of my time just giving you examples of what's going on around the country and a little bit around the world in this regard. So the Department of Energy defines co-location of solar and agriculture as basically solar and agriculture happening adjacent to each other or in the same place. And dual use solar, as defined by American Farmland Trust, is pretty much the same thing, simultaneous on the same piece of land. Agrivoltaics gets a little more specific in that we're talking about areas that are specifically designed to allow a viable farm operation, and not just allowing for the things to happen on the same place. But I would argue that we need a viable solar operation as well to make this really work. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. So there's a concept called the land efficiency ratio, also maybe referred to as the land use efficiency, which talks about, so in the picture here, you've got a plot of land with potatoes on it and an equally sized plot of land, say it's an acre, with solar on it. Put those in the same place, you might get a slightly reduced amount of solar power coming in because you need to reduce the number of panels that you have in order to allow enough light to hit the crop underneath. In the example that this comes from, they actually found that the potato yield was increased because of a little bit of additional shading. And if you add those production percentages together, you get an efficiency ratio. So essentially, you're producing 86% more resources on this 1 acre of land by putting these two things together. This is very much not the case for all kinds of agriculture. And I would argue it also doesn't take into account the additional costs that are incurred in, for example, modifying the solar panels that are raised up in order to allow for tractors or other work to be done underneath them. And it also doesn't necessarily take into account the additional challenges of doing that cultivation under these panels, avoiding the poles, making sure that you're not digging in places where there are buried wires and these sorts of things. So this land use efficiency ratio doesn't necessarily take into account those costs. Another sort of a theoretical concept to keep in mind here is the idea of a displacement value. And this actually came out of a specific development that's happening up in Jefferson County, right now, where the solar developer there is thinking about multi-use opportunities under their solar panels and within and around their solar panels. And so this displacement value idea is basically the idea that it's essentially taking into account that additional cost that it takes to make things coexist in one place. So the example that they give is if you're talking about grazing sheep in solar panels, then you might consider the additional cost that's incurred by, for example, trucking sheep to and from a solar site, because oftentimes one flock services multiple solar sites. So that's an additional cost that has to be taken into account in the calculation of whether it makes sense to graze those sheep underneath the solar panels. Another component here that I would like folks to keep in mind as we go through all these various examples is equity. And so the idea there being their solar panels are going in on land where rental rates for siting those solar panels are anywhere here in Tompkins County. They're often between $1,000 and $2,000 per acre per year, which is a pretty substantial amount of money. And I think we need to be thinking about who's getting that money. If all of that money is flowing into the hands of folks who already have a lot of land, a lot of power, a lot of money, that's going to exacerbate existing inequities in our communities and in our society. So to the extent possible, I think it's important for us to keep in mind how this conversation can be used to enable land access for historically marginalized populations, for beginning farmers, and for others who don't necessarily have land access. And then also a little more complex there is thinking about how these direct payments for solar siting can flow to folks other than folks who already have a lot of land and power. So with that, I'm going to jump into a whole lot of examples. So sort of the lowest hanging fruit example when it comes to agri-solar agrivoltaics is pollinators, pollinator-friendly solar. So basically planting flowers in and around a solar installation. And so there's a whole lot of benefits of this. Ecosystem services vary. And there's the potential for income from beekeeping. There's also, cooling panels has the additional influence or impact of potentially increasing the output from those panels. And I'm having a little trouble here seeing my notes, so if you bear with me, I'm gonna bring this up on another screen. There are also challenges there. And one of the biggest is just that since this is one of the low-hanging fruits, there's not a whole lot of seed to go around right now. Folks are having challenges accessing the seed mixes that are recommended in order to establish pollinator plantings under solar. One of the next ones that I think is pretty well known is solar grazing. And so oftentimes this happens with sheep, in large part because unlike goats, sheep tend to browse lower and tend to gnaw on wires slightly less. Unlike cows, they're small enough often to fit underneath the panels, whereas cows or horses or other larger animals could damage the panels. There's a whole lot of benefits here as well. Really fairly substantial income streams for grazers are being seen anywhere between $300 to $600 per acre. And this is something that a developer would contract with a grazer or with a shepherd to actually manage vegetation under the panels. This is a benefit to the developer and to the owner of the installation. Because as we've seen, and if you look at any sort of abandoned farm field, you see that it sort of regenerates and things grow up. And in this area, it's often goldenrod and asters that come in first, and then you get honeysuckle, and then maybe ashes or other sort of weedy species, and then eventually your solar panels are all shaded over. So you want to manage that. It costs developers a lot of money to manage the vegetation under solar panels, and often that takes that takes the form of mechanical management of lawnmowers and trimmers and those sorts of things. So sheep can offset that and can replace that essentially. There's a lot of management involved there. You need graziers who know what they're doing, graziers who have appropriately sized flocks. So going back to that equity consideration that I mentioned earlier, this is an interesting one in that grazers can be paid to access land. So grazers who don't necessarily have ready access to land, this could potentially be a really good option. There's also potential soil sequestration benefits in appropriately managed land. There's also some significant challenges with solar grazing, things that need to be worked out or need to be included in the planning for the installation, access to water and the appropriate seed mixes planted. In New York State, most farmers, most grazers, most shepherds have relatively few animals. Most flocks are less than 25 animals, and in the sorts of scales that David was talking about, a 25 plus megawatt facility is hundreds of acres, and a 25 head flock is not going to manage that. So there's a matter of upscaling the size of some of the flocks and increasing the processing facilities in order to manage the meat that comes from lambs in those flocks. And there also just aren't enough sheep in New York State to manage all of the solar that is going in. Estimates are there's about 80,000 sheep in New York State right now. And in order to meet the demand for grazing services on the amount of solar that's estimated to be put in, we'll need to increase that to over 250,000 sheep. I will include a link in. I'll get a link to you at some point here. I'll get it to Renee. There's an ongoing study right now at Cornell looking at potentially bringing shepherds and grazers in coordinating shepherds and grazers into cooperative producer organizations in order to make effectively larger flocks that are available to manage the land under larger solar arrays. So I'll put a link in the chat or somewhere. If you are a grazer or a sheep owner and you're interested in being a part of that conversation, fill out that survey. Another quick note when it comes to pollinators and sheep, Nico Kochendorfer, who does a lot of really fascinating research at Cornell, looking at basically part of her research is on that intersection of sheep and solar. Some of her research working with entomologists on campus have found that there's sort of a sweet spot where the right amount of sheep in a facility, managing a facility, can actually facilitate increased pollinator densities, especially if you have the right sorts of seed, the right sorts of plants planted there. So that's not necessarily an antagonistic relationship. That could actually work pretty well together. Some other interesting things that are being examined around the country and around the world. In University of Vermont, they're looking at saffron, which is a really high value crop. I believe it was $5,000 a pound. It's a very expensive crop. So high value crops can really make it worth the pain in the butt of integrating them with solar arrays. Again, going back to those considerations I mentioned in the beginning. So it's a very valuable crop, and it actually it grows from corms, and those corms actually duplicate, and farmers can sell those corms, and those corms actually duplicate quite well under solar panels in heavy shade areas. The downside is that the stigma, which is this red thing that in this picture, that the person's finger is on this red thing, that's the stigma. That's what's actually harvested from saffron. The yield of stigmas is actually really reduced under panels. So growing the saffron outside of the direct shade of the panels is probably a better option for actually yielding, getting the marketable yield. You have to be careful about the soils that they're planted on, and it's very expensive to establish. The corms are quite expensive, which also means there's a good market for corms. Another option that's being examined in the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, They're looking at cranberries, and this is particularly interesting, I think, in Massachusetts, because they have sort of a unique thing that I wonder if David could give any insight on at the end. This agricultural solar tariff generation unit, which actually it gives developers an incentive if there is agriculture being co-located on a site. It pays an additional 6 cents per kilowatt hour generated to essentially subsidize the additional considerations that need to be taken into account for co-locating and doing an agrivoltaic operation. So researchers were particularly interested in this because cranberries have a low light saturation point. So this means as light intensity increases, photosynthesis increases until a certain point where it plateaus, and cranberries plateau really at a really low amount of light. And there's also potential for it to reduce sun scald and fruit rot under shade, but yields are substantially decreased under shade, and it's hard to get the cranberries to turn red under shade. So they're having some challenges there. I mentioned in Jefferson County, there's this interesting developer. There's a developer in Jefferson County that's doing an interesting working on an interesting site. It's about 2,000 acres in total, a little less than 1,000 of which is directly covered by panels. And they're doing a whole bunch of interesting things. So they're one of the only ones I've seen, and there may be others out there, but they're one of the only ones I've seen looking at incorporating row crops and making sort of concessions and working around the reality of row cropping equipment. So they're working with a dairy that's hosting some of the facility, and they've expanded the spacing between their panels in order to allow for manure injection, and that's what we see in this picture here. So manure injection is a way to reduce runoff and volatilization and emissions, nitrogen oxide emissions from spreading manure. It also reduces smells and those sorts of things. And so a 28-foot spacing allows for this equipment to pass. And they're also considering different ways to trial and evaluate different ways of enhancing carbon sequestration in this development. In Europe, they're doing some really interesting things. So this one in particular is a raspberry planting, and there's sort of just this like glowing description of how it's going for them at Albert's Raspberry Farm, having solar panels over their raspberries. Just that everything is going well. Less pests, less disease. Well-being is increased during harvests because you're in the shade of the panels. And lots of really great things happening. But that's not necessarily transferable to the United States, in part because these panels have to be increased in height in order to make this possible. And it's hard, and David might be able to address this a little bit better at the end as well, but it's hard to get financing for sort of non-conventional installations in the United States. The financiers are not quite as interested in paying the additional costs of having panels mounted 6 or 8 feet above the ground instead of lower to the ground. There's more danger of wind and more materials involved. Other plants that could be grown sort of directly under panels are generally shade-tolerant crops. And so this first list here is from UMass Amherst. The second list is from the folks in Europe. Ginger sort of jumped out to me. I know there's some ginger production happening, particularly in Tompkins County. Could be an interesting one to try growing in the shade of panels. And one of the things that they found at UMass Amherst was plants grown under shade, even these shade-tolerant plants grown under shade in a dry and a hot year, perform considerably better than plants that were comparable plants that were grown not in the shade of the panels. But the exact same sort of research design in a wet and a cool year had the opposite outcome, where the plants that were grown in the shade had worse outcomes, worse yields. So there's sort of a resilience question here of perhaps having some of your plants grown under shade and some of them not grown under shade, just in case, so that your bases are covered in whether it's a cool and a wet year or a hot and a dry year. And this will be the last example here, and I'm not going to go into it too much. There's a link in the resources at the end here. But Jack's Solar Garden out in Colorado is a about a 6-acre solar farm that's doing all kinds of different things experimentally and hosting tours and talking to policymakers and doing great research. So lots of interesting things going on in this field. And I think that's all. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Graham. It's encouraging, but at the same time, boy, there's a lot of research ahead of us to figure this out, and a lot of policy and a lot of figuring out how are the equity issues in terms of how are profits distributed in this system. Well, now we want to turn to the many questions that have come in. And Melina, do you want to read off some of the questions to our panelists, and we'll see who wants to answer them unless they're directed at a particular person?
Yeah, so it looks like we have about 14 questions that haven't yet been answered. So the first one. Okay, so for large solar arrays, could you guys discuss the troubling issue that the larger the solar array, the greater the financial concentration? For example, corporate hegemony, which concentrates power, pricing, and policy, which too often does not have our consumer interests at heart, still less remotely address the social and economic justice issues.
I can respond a little quickly to that. So yeah, that is of interest to that issue is of interest to a great many people. It's in part of what goes into the discussion about distributed generation versus centralized generation and the extent that that could work. I mean, the fundamental problem that we face, aside from firstly, I'll say there's a lot of potential for developing community-owned or locally controlled generation, but unfortunately, in the current system, the access to the capital that is needed in order to do the transition in the timeframes that we're talking about is so great that even a lot of the solar developers are at the mercy of the existing financial system in terms of what they want to do in ways that are very unfortunate. So this is a truth that that there aren't any easy ways to respond to, except there is a lot of potential at the local level and some ways at the state and other levels to address aspects of it. And I'll just also say that the law puts certain aspects of equity front and center actually in the law that need to be taken into place. And it's, actually how that happens is pretty complicated, but there are committees in New York State that have been working since the law was passed to really think hard about that, involve some frontline community members thinking about what does actual equitable energy transition look like in New York State and what should be in place.
Thank
And
you.
I could provide more background if people want to follow up with me on that. There's a lot of information online about that too.
Yeah, thank you. And then for the next question we have in regards to roadside solar. Adding bike paths running alongside solar panels, which would be a multi-functioning high sustainability solution. Is this at all a feasible idea?
Yeah, so the short answer is sure. It just depends who owns the land and what they want to do with it and how wide that roadside area is. So one parallel example of using roadsides and sometimes utility rights of way as recreation spaces is snowmobile trails. Oftentimes those are actually an existing rights of way, right? It's a great example of turning those into multifunctional spaces. So in many urban areas, off-road bike paths are in city-owned rights of way. And so the short answer is it depends on who owns the right of way. And there are absolutely ways to try to make sure that it's a multifunctional space that just really has to do with who has the land, what are they planning for? So especially in more urban spaces, we see that there are actually some examples outside of Rochester here where we do have off-street bike paths that are in part in roadside rights of way. So I can't point you to an example on the thruway, for example, but on smaller roads, absolutely we have that.
Great, thank you. And then for the next question, is there any effort to explore covering man-made watercourses per California canals with solar arrays as there is no foliage problems and etc.?
I could say that there is I can't answer that question in detail, but there is a faculty member who recently joined the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell, who is one of the people that is researching aquavoltaics, as they call it, which is part of what you're talking about. And if you wanted to contact me afterwards, I could direct you to his, connect you with them. But I don't know how to answer that. I don't know if somebody else does. There's some, I know, but it's got like everything. There's no silver bullet kind of things work some places and they don't work other places. So.
And we don't have canals in terms of man-made waterways so much.
Well, we have like right here in Ithaca, we have like the flood control channel, for example.
Right.
So,
It's the
we don't
smaller
have
ones.
the same
Right.
extent, but
Yeah.
But there's and I will just say it's not just canals, it's also they're looking at lakes, they're looking at a lot of different kind of water, aquatic systems where some of them would be very inappropriate to do this for environmental and other reasons and cost reasons. Some of them it might work. So, but evaluation of that's just starting.
I'll just add here, in the area where I'm sitting, right, like, oh, we have tons of Erie Canal, right? But we also have people using that recreationally and commercially. So if we covered it, then that would be a conflict. But at the same time, canals also have rights of way, right? There's actually an area alongside the canal that's in that space. And so here, for example, those have bike paths, but it could also have more open space, right? There was some recent debate in our area about cutting down trees in those spaces, but there's often a requirement that they be open space. So canal side rights of way might also be an option in terms of thinking about transportation infrastructure.
And since it's specifically about the thruway and really about the Canal Corporation in that context, I don't, it'd be interesting to find out. I don't know whether the Canal Corporation, which controls most of what are going on in those kinds of places, has thought seriously about the potential for this. I'm not sure.
Thank you. And for the next question, we have, why is biomass called renewable still less green, other than the plants we grow, but the smokestacks that burn these plants at a scale pump massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
I would say that's kind of pretty far, outside the scope of what probably the three of our areas of expertise is. But in my college, which is College of Ag and Life Science, and in general, the issue of biomass, forest regeneration rates, there's a lot of people that are doing a lot of work at this. And this is, I'm not qualified to sort of like specifically answer that question because I know it's actually complex answer. But there are a lot of people doing work on this. And I will say that biomass was in the, when I first started working in energy in the 80s and 90s, biomass was considered a green. And now, as Peter McDonald is suggesting, there are a lot of people that challenge in at least not necessarily every context, but there are a lot of people that challenge the basic idea that biomass should unquestionably be thought of as a green technology. So it's being pretty heavily challenged in most cases.
Mhm.
Thank you. And then for the next question we have you looked at how the utility hosting capacity maps compare to the highway systems with right-of-ways that could work for hosting solar arrays?
So I personally have not, and I'm curious to know if David, in terms of some of the maps that you showed, if that's a layer that's been added. I think it's a great reminder that this is knowable though. So for example, in that Michigan planning document I referred to, they do consider basically the distance to the grid as one of the considerations for whether or not siting roadside solar would be appropriate. Now, I can say though that basically roadsides and roads are corridors. So oftentimes utilities are actually aligning themselves with roadsides because they're corridors. So in many spaces, the road itself and the roadside is a corridor that utilities are taking advantage of. And so in many spaces, the answer would be yes, that this could be well aligned. So we could find out.
Yeah, I would just underscore what you said. I mean, I think there's a lot of hosting capacity in areas where there are not highway systems. That doesn't mean not road systems, other kinds of, it depends what you mean by highways, Terry, but in general, there should be a lot of overlap there because of what you just said, Kaitlin. And I don't know whether anybody's looked at that explicitly. Should be done.
Mhm.
Thank
I
you.
know it was
Kaitlin
raised.
is probably the perfect person to do it. So.
This, I will say the Q&A, I saw another question. I was like, oh, I don't know the answer yet, but I can go answer that for you. So
That's great. I know this issue of grid interconnection has come up in the battle to stop Bitcoin mining in New York State, and the idea of them having the money to go to renewables to run the Bitcoin mining facilities, but maybe taking up some very high value interconnection points, making it more expensive for us later to hook up renewables to run our actual houses on. So I think this issue of who gets to connect at the cheapest, points is very important for us to have an open discussion about.
And just to underscore what you just said, I mean, the single most important aspect of whether or not a solar facility is feasible to be built economically is whether it has access to the grid, just to underscore that. By far, I mean, if
By
you're
far.
more than a mile or two away from a good grid access point, the economics just isn't going to work no matter how much subsidy you put into it. So.
Okay, Melinda.
Okay, and for the next question we have, is it true that brownfields and coal ash dumps, etc., do not have to continue monitoring for pollutant runoff if solar arrays are placed on top of them?
So the answer is it depends. It depends on the cap. It depends on the use of the brownfield and what the agreement has been. And so it really depends on the specific bright field and what the agreement was for basically containing that site. So it's cheaper to put in a bright field when you have a penetrable cap, but then that could potentially lead to leakage, right, in terms of mounting a ground-based array. But if you have an impenetrable cap, you can still mount a ground-based array. It will just be more expensive. So it really depends on the specific bright field that we're talking about.
And Kaitlin, isn't it fair to say that there would be no case in theory, not necessarily in practice, but in theory, there would be no case where that monitoring would not be required just because there was solar on it?
Right.
In other words, the environmental considerations would have to be addressed in terms of whatever pollutant runoff there was. It's not just because you get a free pass because there's solar on it.
Right. And in general, for brownfield remediation, there's just, it depends on what you plan the next use to be in terms of the gradation of what needs to be done. So solar is one of the potential, but it's not held in some uniquely separate category compared to other potential things you might do with a former brownfield site.
Kaitlin, years ago, thin film photovoltaics was, I remember we invested quite a bit of money as a state in trying to manufacture those in the state. And I know that that was what was used to cap the Madison County landfill. So the thin film photovoltaics, would they just be a lot more feasible to cap most of these landfills compared to, the rigid arrays? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that specifically off the top of my head. I mean, there's a variety of options for thinking about how you can cover a cap. So there seems to be a lot of different possibilities out there. So the photo I showed was just of the specific landfill cap that was here in the city of Rochester, and that's on city land, but it really depends on, the geography of the space. And that was a flat space, for example. So if it's a hill or there are other considerations, it might depend.
I would just make another comment that more generic is that we're talking about what we know now. This is an area where there has been research for many years, but like the level of research into new technologies is, because of the urgency of this issue, it's just like increasing by leaps and bounds. So we could probably have an entirely different conversation 5 years from now about these kinds of technologies and options. So
Great.
Okay, and then one question specifically for Graham. What about wool from sheep? Is it historically an important crop in the Finger Lakes and other crops such as ginseng, ginger, hemp? Do we need to think about multi-cropping?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So as far as wool is concerned, the market for commodity wool is really, really bad right now. It's you just can't make any money off it, and it's cheaper to throw it away. Specialty wool, there's absolutely a market for it. Selling it at farmers markets, getting it processed and selling skeins, those sorts of things. But there's a whole lot of costs involved there, and large scale flocks, it's really hard to do all of that. But I think I certainly think it's worth keeping in mind. The multi-use or multi-cropping, I forget how it was phrased, I think is a great thought. And one way that's already happening is sort of in the conversation around agroforestry. And so ginseng is a perfect crop in agroforestry systems. It could also potentially be a great crop in solar systems, along with mushrooms, along with basically a lot of things that work well in forest farming and agroforestry settings are probably worthy of investigation here. I think that's a great point.
Could I just underscore one of my themes I'm trying to make is you have to think a lot about scale of operation when you're thinking about these systems. So, something that works on a 5 to 10 acre scale may or may not work on 1,000-acre scale on an individual site. And then you also have to think about, in terms of market potential for agricultural crops. I mean, if you're suddenly bringing in many thousands of acres statewide, to double or triple the production of some specialty crops, what does that do to the market price? These are things that people just starting to think about. So
I know that we're at 1:17, but I am fine with us continuing to answer questions, but just acknowledging to you attendees who maybe have to go off to something else, to feel free. We'll keep recording and it'll be on the video when we release it to you later. So let's go on to some next questions, Melina.
Yeah, so for the next question, would it make sense to provide incentives to farmers to allow panels to be placed on their barns instead of in their fields? Many barns, like those at dairy farms, can hold hundreds or even thousands of panels, allowing for systems in the 200 to 500 kilowatt range. Multiply that by the number of viable barns across the state, and it really adds up. No farmland is used, and even small to medium-sized farms could participate, instead of only those who own thousands of acres.
you want me to do that one, Graham? Okay, so there are actually some incentives in place already that have been there for quite a while for on-farm use of electricity. So when you're talking, again, this is a scale issue in my mind primarily. So it's actually quite easy, and there's some incentive programs that exist to enable farmers to put solar on their barns and use them. They can put it into the grid, but essentially they can't produce that much more than they actually use on the farm historically. So there's a certain kind of incentive already in place for that. So then the question becomes really quantitatively, I think this is a very good idea, and it could be probably increased. Incentives could be increased beyond what they are now to help more people do that on their buildings, on their structures. And this goes back to the idea of trying to minimize it's a kind of low impact site. It's kind of obvious. It should be done more. It could be done more. It is being done to some extent already. It's not going to add up to anything close to what the state needs to get to, but that doesn't mean it's not important to do more of it. So
thank you. And then for another question we have, what about putting solar collectors and arrays atop buildings and parking lots? Is this feasible, cost effective, or warranted in the right situations?
Yeah, this is a short answer. So I think a lot of those challenges we talked about were cost and basically who owns the infrastructure. So on that map I showed, that the link will be there for the Federal Highway Administration map where they're tracking states doing this, not necessarily county and local governments. We have examples of state right-of-ways that are in parking garages and lots being covered in solar panels. They can create shade or basically cover if it's a one-level lot while also generating energy. So there are examples of this both across the US and internationally of people doing that for parking structures. So it's a great example of not the roadside per se, but using transportation infrastructure. And so similarly, kind of like that mentioning about barns, transportation depots, which might be basically where the snowplow is parked, people are putting solar panels on those. So thinking about other kinds of spaces that are not residential, that still might be small buildings, but thinking about basically what else can we cover in solar panel that's part of state assets that could be harnessed.
Again, I might just add, Kaitlin already mentioned that there is a state program, the Build Ready program. It was in your presentation, that is looking at some of these issues. But one of the things that some of us have been trying to push harder for is that the state should take a more proactive planning approach to trying to identify the best places to put solar, as opposed to the approach now is more let's keep it off the worst places. And you know, just one other thought, for the most part, it's going on farmland because that is the cheapest place to put it, you know, for the most part. So there are some equity considerations that you need to think about when you start putting your energy sources on places where it's more expensive to develop. And that has to do with who's paying for electricity and what, you know, and if it starts being more costly to produce it, like who's paying those higher prices. So it's not, again, you know, there's a lot of things going on simultaneously as we move ahead, and different values that need to be balanced against each other.
That's absolutely true. Let's just take a couple more, Melina.
Okay. And then another question we have is, how does New York deal with lots of solar potential in the summer, but hardly any in the winter? Battery storage doesn't work for weeks without significant sun throughout November through February, and I have not heard of a good solution for this problem.
Well, this is one of the considerations. I would say that it's a small consideration right now because the reality is we don't have that much wind and solar on the grid yet. So it is a consideration right now. It is, you know, as we move more and more towards 100% renewables in a very short time frame, this is going to become more and more of an issue. And there could be a signal technological answer to it, but there's a whole array of different kinds of approaches to thinking about this question, ranging from different kinds of better storage. And there's a lot of research going into that right now, including at Cornell, but in many, many other places, a lot of it funded by DOE to improve storage capacity. There's also, you know, this is the idea of consumer demand. Like if you were tuned in at all to the heat crisis in California a few weeks back, one of the things that the utilities were able to do is essentially say, let's use less electricity now because it's a crisis right now. So that's just one example, but there are many other kind of ways of sort of like manipulating, if you will, the amount of electricity which is needed at a given time to deal with some of those issues. But fundamentally, the question is right on target about, and by the way, another thing is like the geography from which you bring your electricity in, because it's often the case that particularly, you know, wind and solar have some potential in some context to balance each other out in terms of their, in terms of when they're available. But batteries, the storage issue is a huge one that's been there, and it needs to be advanced significantly if we're going to reach our goals. No question about that. And there's more and more proposals just in the solar space for joint on-site storage and for at solar facilities, because there is some potential in sort of the short to medium term to do this already. What's hard is like, longer term storage is very difficult.
And good thing we have.
By the way, just one other quick thing is a lot of people go to they start talking about hydrogen when you start talking about this issue. So
Yeah. But it is good. I don't know if you had mentioned that we have some decent hydro resources, which also
Right.
are kind of 24/7 throughout
Right.
the year. Although the micro hydro, options, which we have not done much to develop yet, would not help us in the summertime, but that's when we'll have plenty of solar.
and
But
there are some people, I mean, I'm not an advocate for this, but there are some people that are saying new nuclear technologies are going to help with this issue as well. So.
and be necessary. I think that what we maybe start to wrap up here. I think that we're in an era where there needs to be this very deep, broad social shift of consciousness towards energy, to being aware of energy, where it's coming from, how much you're using, to just be a lot more tuned in, and like people in California are learning, like, okay, I guess I have to turn the air conditioner up if I don't want a brownout or a blackout, let me have some cooling, not all the cooling that I would prefer. So we are in this era of transition. And I just want to once again thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for this good discussion. We'll try to answer the unanswered questions, and send those out along with the video link and the PowerPoints later on. But I really want to encourage everybody today that's attending to stay engaged in this topic and help to guide the decision makers for the greatest overall benefit for our communities going ahead, in this area. Just don't be shy about talking with our local and state elected officials about policy options, for guiding the placement of these much needed solar and wind farms. And we may need to direct some of our tax dollars into subsidies to get more solar onto buildings and landfills and rights of way, and maybe have to have some regulatory approaches towards those investors behind the large solar arrays solar projects that are going in. There's a negotiating, what are the terms of the deal here for for the people of New York State. And I also think we may need to more actively support the smaller farmers who would like to host solar arrays, but need configurations that work for their crops and, might need assistance with making all of that work. So there's just, as you know, so much to be figured out yet, and quickly. But I'm hopeful that by working together, we can find those better solutions and make our communities more resilient going forward. So I just want to thank all the panelists again, and thanks to the attendees for joining us today. We hope to see you on October 26th for our next Finger Lakes Forecast webinar. It'll be on public health impacts of climate change in our region. So keep an eye out for an email from us with more information about that. So that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much, everyone.